the fact that the faith that I grew up with didn't have much of a history to it was troublesome.
All right.
I was encouraged, I think, to see a sort of God and country connection in American history. And then beyond that, I was encouraged to look back to the era of what we call pure New Testament Christianity, the first, second centuries A.D., as being sort of the golden age that we modeled our own Southern Baptist faith after. But the long period in between, that 1,500 years or so between the end of the Apostolic Age and the Protestant Reformers, I was always told that that was the Dark Ages. That was the time when things got lost and that the true faith was trampled on.
In fact, your original description was even a bigger period. You talk about the New Testament and then the American God and country.
Well, that's true.
I mean, that's even a bigger window of...
Baptists feel maybe a little less connected to Martin Luther and John Calvin than some other Protestants. Yeah. We have some vague idea that they did a good thing by striking a blow or two against the Pope.
Yeah.
But
well, there are some groups in America that look to Azusa Street, the beginning of the 1900s, as kind of the beginning of the reawakening, or the rediscovery of that which was lost way back.
And that was one of the interesting things I encountered as we went along, is that every type of evangelical Christian that I encountered had a different moment when it was lost, whether it was with Constantine or Gregory the Great or whoever it was when the corruptions took over, and they had a different end period. Yeah. Was it Martin Luther? Was it
John Knox?
Right, all the way up to, as you say, Azusa Street, or even earlier. There are, later, there are all sorts of different dates, and that was one of the things that started to confuse me. These Dark Ages were a little hard to pin down.
Yeah. Okay. So you're in the Navy. Was your faith a part of your life when you're in the Navy?
I'm afraid it didn't have much depth of earth. Okay. I think that I might have lost it altogether if it hadn't been for the fact that my mother, a wonderful lady who was, I think, concerned for my soul out there in the great wide world, had heard somewhere that C.S. Lewis might be the sort of writer who would appeal to me. So she sent me a set of C.S. Lewis's books. And I don't think maybe to this day she realizes what she did. She probably saved my soul that day. But he was the first writer I had ever encountered who spoke to me, who made Christianity sensible to me. And one of the things he did, one of the reasons that I picked up his books and was able to read them, was that he had similar interests to mine. He didn't just write religious books, he also wrote books of science fiction and fantasy, which were always interests of mine. So I picked up C.S. Lewis, and it was amazed by what I found there. And really, he wrote about mere Christianity. One of his books is called Mere Christianity, and by that he meant the basic core of beliefs that all Christians believe in. And he made that seem like a real vivid thing. And so I thought, this is something I can commit myself to. And I took off from that point. It became, I think, a lively, wide-awake member of the tradition that I'd been born in.
Let me stop here for a second. When I was in seminary, one of my theological professors gave it the term, that which has quasi-unanimously been believed by all Christians in all places at all time.
Right. That was the vision, that there was some sort of core of we wouldn't have used the word, but some core of Catholicity, some way in which we weren't just a group of divided sects, but we all had some common center.
All right.
So once I read C.S. Lewis, I had a tremendous reconversion to Christianity. And for the first time, here was a faith that seemed real, connected to real life. It wasn't just a kind of an existential leap in the dark to keep you from having to be an atheist. And it was something solid that I could sink my teeth into. And because of that solidity, the person of Jesus himself began to make sense and began to really speak to my heart and to show himself as somebody that you really could build a whole life around. And so I committed myself to him from that time and have tried to be a Christian since then.
Did it lead you into ministry?
Well, actually, one of the first things I did on the basis of that idea of mere Christianity, that there was this common set of beliefs that we could defend, we could go to work on. We could leave all the doubtful disputations between the various denominations. We could leave that to the idle philosophers back home to deal with. So I said, on the basis of this, I'm going to join a non-denominational missions group and get started with sleeves rolled up, down-to-earth work. So I went off with a non-denominational group for overseas missions work.
Okay.
That was the mid-1980s.
Was it missions in terms of teaching people to plant, or was it translations, or was it
It was
proclamation?
actually overseas foreign missions going from place to place. It was a mobile mission, church planting and evangelization.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
Was willing to speak in language that maybe an evangelical wouldn't have used. He began to use some historical sounding language. In fact, in some ways, he started to talk a little like a Catholic. And I was curious about that. Here was somebody who seemed to think that mere Christianity had included Roman Catholics. But I always had been taught to believe that that they were not true Christians, and that they had lost the faith for us, and that there wasn't that sort of historical continuity.
How was it lost? How were you taught that it was lost?
Basically, I think the version of it that I believed in was that in the 4th century, when the Emperor Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, that there was an enormous flood of half-converted pagans who came into the church and brought all their old pagan ways with them. And there was a problem with nominalism at that point. And so all of these pagan things came in, and in a big syncretistic hodgepodge, they began to influence, and they basically created the Catholic faith. And that was probably the version of it that I believed in.
Okay, and the leaders in this thirst for power and prestige emulated the leaders of Rome, and that's why you end up with all the trappings.
Right. Yeah. That there was this kind of melting pot of Roman pagan ideas, along with some version of Christianity.
Okay. Well, was it this reading of Lewis that then got your heart started towards Rome?
Well, actually, Lewis remained a Protestant all his life, so it's not quite as simple as that. I think what happened is that when I went out to go to work on the missions field, right away I encountered something that I'd never really seen at home. When I was at home and surrounded with people who thought basically the way I did on theological matters, there was a sense you were protected from some of the unworkability of mere Christianity in the real world. I'd gone out on this on the basis of mere Christianity, and here I was in a mission work. We had 28 different nationalities involved in the mission I was involved in, and at least that many different forms of Protestant Christianity. And being put into this crucible, this melting pot of all of these ideas, you began to see right away the limitations of the mere Christianity concept. We made converts, but after we'd made them, we didn't know what to do with them. Should we insist on having them baptized? If we baptized them, should it be by immersion or some other method? Should we baptize their children? For the man that was converted and he was on his 3rd wife, should we have sent him back to his 2nd wife or his 1st? All of these various issues. And because of our own dividedness on these issues, we weren't able to give a straight answer. So all we were left able to do was to say, go out and find yourself a Bible-believing church, even though we ourselves weren't able to agree on which churches believed the Bible and which didn't.
It's interesting, stop there for a second, that a well-known Protestant evangelist who has crusades that most people are very familiar with, when the crusade is done and people have come forward and accepted Jesus as their Lord and Savior and they've said the prayer, they receive instructions on what they're to do next. Right. And in this non-denominational environment, the advice they get is find a Bible-believing church, one that prays and teaches the Bible. I mean, in essence, that's as deep as they can get in terms of instructions on what to do next for the same problem.
Exactly. When Jesus sent the apostles out into the world, he told them to convert people, but he also said, teach them to observe everything that I've commanded you. And yet we couldn't agree on what those things were.
Interesting. Yeah.
So we had to keep a sort of a polite silence. And all we could really agree on was the necessity of having a personal relationship with Jesus, which I, to this day, think is a necessity.
Yeah.
But we couldn't agree on what that personal relationship did and did not legitimately include. And so the only way to keep the peace was to have an almost contentless faith. Yeah. Wonderful man. To this day, one of the godliest Christians I've ever met, made at one point a really vital decision on the future of our work on the basis solely of an interior sense of what God was saying to us right now. And I thought, coming from my perspective, that the decision he made was doctrinally shaky. So I went to him to talk it out. Once again, we were friends. And he said something that really brought it to a head. He said, Rod, I stayed up all night for several nights in a row. I prayed as hard as I could, and in the end, God showed me the correct interpretation. Now, who could argue with that? I mean, could I say that I had studied harder and longer than he had? Because I knew I hadn't.
Or you prayed harder?
Prayed harder, listened to God better? I knew I didn't. So, if it wasn't on those bases, then what? How could I ever hope to maintain that I had understood the Bible more correctly than he had? And there wasn't any way that I could see. So the answer seemed pretty clear, that I should admit that he had me beat in every category and accepted his judgment and joined his denomination, right? Except that there were many more other saints on that work than just him, and many more other denominations, and they were all better Christians than I was, and godlier.
And with different opinions.
And with different opinions.
Yeah.
So I reached the conclusion that it must be possible to be sincere, godly, and wrong anyhow on these things.
So you recognize the problem.
The problem,
There's
yeah.
a problem here. You know, there's something wrong here with this picture. That doesn't necessarily take you to the Catholic Church.
No, it didn't.
Well, what did
it didn't. It drove me back to something that I'd read in C.S. Lewis. He would often talk about, he wouldn't so much make a straight appeal to the Scripture, because after all, opinions differ.
Yeah.
He would sometimes talk about the constant teaching of the church through the ages. He would talk about the ancient Christian faith. He would talk about the church that's been marching like an army with banners since 33 A.D. And I said, my goodness, I really see the need for this now. There's, in this whole sea of human opinion, isn't there some way to learn what the original Christianity was like? And so I began to read him closer. And I remembered one reference where he had mentioned a book that maybe had been the most significant book in his own journey from atheism, the book called The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton. And I sought out a copy of that book and found one eventually, but could only find it in a Roman Catholic bookshop. And when I did that, I found out something even worse, that this G.K. Chesterton was not only a Catholic, I knew that, but I learned that he was something worse. He was a convert to Catholicism from Protestantism. And Protestantism, but from Lewis's own Church of England. So there I was presented with the problem that C.S. Lewis had just sent me, as the only man that had ever been able to make history understandable to him. He just sent me to a man who ultimately had ceased to be able to believe in Protestantism at all. And it was a watershed. So I did read G.K. Chesterton. I read that first book and then read just about everything that he'd ever wrote after that. And it was the sanest, healthiest, most amazing thing. And I didn't accept his Catholicism right away. That was still a long journey. But his outlook was so sane.
Because your baptism is a long way from where Chesterton ended up.
Right. Yeah.
That's so many viewpoints.
That's true.
There's a big well for you.
Exactly. I wasn't ready to make the leap by a long shot.
Yeah.
I was still troubled by his popish ideas, but the sanity that I saw there left me thinking that at the very least, Catholicism couldn't be as black as it had been painted. And so that was the beginning. Chesterton, still to this day, my great hero. I even owe my wife to G.K. Chesterton. She saw me reading a book of Chesterton's when we were still strangers, struck up a conversation, and the rest is history.
There you go. Talk now about what you've discovered as a Catholic looking back at this Dark Ages. I mean, where the idea of the Dark Ages came from, and how should we look at those years?
Well, one of the things that Chesterton led me to were some, and Lewis as well, some other writers that they had recommended. And they mentioned two people. They mentioned a man named John Henry Newman, and they also mentioned another set of people called the Fathers of the Church, which I had never heard anything about, really. Maybe vaguely mentioned. And here seemed to be some sort of place where you could really find out something about what the early church believed in. In fact, when I read Newman made a statement that shocked me. in spite of the fact that I had grown pretty friendly to Catholicism in the form of Chesterton, at least patient to listen to it, Newman said something that shocked me. He said that for the historian, that history says many things, it's got many ambiguities, but the one thing you can definitely be certain when you look at the records of the past, and that is that the Christianity of history is not Protestantism.